I tried to make my boyfriend jealous by lying about his best friend. He didn't even care. It was never supposed to turn out like this. When I first started, I thought I was doing something harmless, just testing the waters, maybe shaking things up enough to get his attention. I didn't think it would actually lead anywhere. I definitely didn't think it would blow up my whole life. All I really wanted was to feel like things used to feel. That was it. I wanted to get back to the version of us where I didn't lie awake wondering if he still wanted me, if he still saw me the same way. Back then, it felt easy. I felt secure. But somewhere along the line, that slipped away, and instead of confronting it directly, I went for the worst solution possible. I kept trying to play little games, not realizing how fast those games would spin out of my control. The truth is, I've never had a great track record when it comes to relationships. If you asked any of my friends, they'd probably say the same thing. I was always the girl who picked wrong. It was this constant cycle where I would meet someone, get swept up in the beginning, then slowly realize he wasn't that into me or was keeping one foot out the door the entire time, always. And instead of just walking away, I'd hang on longer than I should. It left me with a lot of baggage. Every breakup chipped away at me until I didn't even trust my own judgment anymore. I always felt like the crazy girlfriend, the one who cared too much, while the guy barely cared at all. And then I met Nolan. I wasn't even looking for anything that night. I'd gone out to a club with a friend after swearing up and down that I was done dating for a while. I'd just gotten out of something messy, and the last thing I needed was another man to distract me. But I went anyway, telling myself it was just a night of music and drinks. That's when I saw him. It was hard not to notice him. He was just that handsome, that magnetic. We talked at the bar for a while, and even though I told myself it was nothing, there was this pull there. He asked for my number before the night ended, and I gave it to him without thinking much of it. At most, I figured maybe he'd text me once or twice and then disappear like the rest. But the next day he texted, and then again the day after. Nolan didn't just send half-hearted "what's up" messages. He actually wanted to talk. He'd call me, ask about my day, tell me he wanted to see me again. At first I brushed him off. I thought maybe he was just being polite or that it would fade out once he realized I wasn't looking for anything serious. But that didn't happen. He actually stayed. Eventually I agreed to meet him for dinner, and that's when things changed. Nolan wasn't like the others. He was thoughtful in a way I'd never experienced before, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't have to beg for attention or affection. He gave it freely. When we started dating seriously, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I thought maybe he'd get bored, or the effort would dry up, or he'd show me some side of himself that proved he was just like the others, but it never happened. Nolan was consistent. He was everything I had ever wanted but never thought I'd actually find. The first 4 years we were together, I honestly thought it had finally happened for me. I had the guy. I had the relationship I used to dream about when I was younger. Even my family noticed the change in me. Everyone said that I seemed happier and more grounded. My parents liked him, which was rare. My friends loved him too, mostly because they could see that I wasn't back to my old patterns anymore. Nolan made me feel like the best version of myself, and everyone could tell. But then, somewhere along the way, things shifted. It wasn't overnight or sudden, but slow and excusable. At first, I ignored it. I told myself it was just stress from work, or that maybe the spark naturally fades a little when you've been together this long. I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal, but it was. Nolan just wasn't the same anymore. The man who used to text me all day just to check in now barely replied to my messages. The guy who used to surprise me with flowers or small gestures acted like being in the same room together was a chore. Conversations got shorter, and he touched me a lot less. I kept brushing it off and telling myself that this was just a phase and things would go back to how they were. I reminded myself that every couple goes through ups and downs, and that I was probably overthinking things like I always did. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore. The man I loved was starting to feel more and more like a stranger, and that was really hard to stomach. I loved him more than anything, but it felt like he could barely give me the time of day. If I asked about his day, I'd get one-line answers or a shrug. If I tried to hug him or pull him close, half the time he'd say he was tired. He wasn't cruel or unkind. It was like he was just absent, like he was physically there, but his mind and heart weren't. I started to fear that maybe he had already mentally checked out of the relationship, that he had decided by himself that we'd run our course, but he didn't have the heart or even the energy to actually break up with me. The idea made me feel sick. The last few years with him had been the happiest of my life, so the thought of him just biding time before he could end it broke my heart. He was the first man who ever really loved me, who ever made me feel like I wasn't too much or not enough. I knew I would never find another man like Nolan, not one who cared like he once had, not one who could make me feel that way again. I knew I'd never get that back if he left me, so I told myself I couldn't let him go. Instead, I started looking for ways to fix it. I'd thought I could just find a way to bring the spark back, so I suggested new date ideas. I booked reservations at restaurants we hadn't tried and bought tickets for movies and concerts I thought he'd like, things like that. And sometimes he'd go along with it, but he was never really present. Even our sex life, which used to be passionate and full of energy, had dwindled to almost nothing. I thought maybe we just needed to push past the routine, so I tried to be more adventurous. I bought new lingerie and suggested things we'd never done before. Sometimes he'd go along with it, but it always felt like he was doing it out of some messed up sense of obligation rather than desire. No matter how much I tried to shake us back into what we used to be, he just stayed so unavailable. I genuinely started to panic. I didn't want to lose him, but I knew that that was where we were headed. I had to do something about our relationship, but I had no idea what. Then it all hit me one afternoon. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard the front door open. It was Ryan, one of Nolan's friends, and more like an employee, really. Nolan ran a contracting company with a handful of his buddies. Since he kept a lot of tools in our garage, sometimes the guys would pop in to get them. He said he was just stopping by to grab some power tools. I let him in without thinking much of it and made small talk while he dug around for the equipment. But then, before he left, he paused, looked at me, and said, "You look nice today." It caught me off guard. I wasn't wearing anything special, but I blushed anyway. I laughed it off, thanked him, and let him out the door. The whole thing was weird. The compliment itself was harmless, but it lingered in my head longer than it should have. I even found myself laughing to myself at the thought of Nolan's reaction. If he had been there, he probably would have punched Ryan, or at least kicked him out of the house immediately. And the thought of Nolan's jealousy gave me an idea, one that led to me messing it all up. When Nolan and I first started dating, he'd been so jealous and possessive. Back then, I loved it. Some people would call it toxic, but to me, it felt like proof of how much he cared. If a guy so much as looked at me, Nolan would get furious. He hated the idea of anyone else having my attention. So I thought that maybe that was the key. Maybe if Nolan saw me with other men, if he thought for even a second that he might lose me, he'd realize what he was putting me through and change. He'd remember how much he loved me and fight to keep me. I know now that that was all wishful thinking, but back then I was so sure of it. I convinced myself it wasn't really wrong and that I wasn't actually cheating. I was just trying to spark something and get the passion back. It started small, with things like laughing really hard while on the phone, even though I was just talking to friends. I'd leave my phone open with fake conversations pulled up, making it seem like I was texting guys when really it was nothing. I wore shorter skirts and lower-cut tops to work or when I went out, hoping Nolan would notice. But he didn't. Or if he did, he didn't care. There were no questions, there was no anger, nothing. The more I tried, the worse it felt. I kept waiting for a reaction that never came. It was like he had become indifferent to me, and that made me even more desperate. So I started planning something bigger. Something that could either save our relationship or ruin it completely. I knew I had to do something drastic, so I did. If Nolan didn't notice the little things I was doing, then I'd make it all harder for him to ignore. I started going out at night more, telling him I was catching up with friends or heading downtown for a drink, and then actually doing it. Sometimes I'd call Nolan from the bar's bathroom and pretend like I was having the time of my life. I wanted him to imagine me out there, dancing and drinking with other men looking at me. But he never gave me the reaction I wanted. He'd answer the phone like he was distracted, tell me to have fun, and then hang up quickly like he was busy. Not once did he ask who I was with, how late I'd be, or why I was going out so much. It was all driving me crazy. After a few nights of that routine, I told myself I had to step it up, that I couldn't just hint at it anymore. If I wanted to shock him into realizing what he had, I needed to take things even further. So I did. One night, I let a man buy me drink after drink until I couldn't ignore the way he was looking at me. I allowed myself flirt and get too close. When he asked if I wanted to leave with him, I said yes. I believed that it was the thing that would finally make Nolan snap. I told myself over and over that I wasn't doing it because I wanted to, but because I had to. If Nolan loved me, then this would wake him up. So, I ended up having sex with a stranger. When I got home the next morning, I braced myself for the explosion. My hair was messy, my clothes smelled like another man's cologne, and I looked like exactly what I had been doing. I walked into the apartment with my heart racing, ready for him to yell, to demand answers, to finally show me he cared enough to get angry. But Nolan didn't say a word. He was sitting at the dining table, studying floor plans for one of his projects, a pencil tucked behind his ear. He glanced up, saw me walk in, and then he went right back to his papers. No questions or suspicion. When he didn't say anything, I told him I'd been out at the club last night. I was hoping it would provoke him, but all he said was, "Hope you had fun," without looking up from his work. I wanted to tell him the truth then and there, just to force a reaction out of him, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. So I hinted at it. I told him about all the guys who had been staring at me, how many tried to buy me drinks, how I danced with strangers all night, but he didn't even flinch. He wasn't even at least a little irritated. He just rolled up his plans, kissed me absent-mindedly on my forehead, and said he had to head out to a job site. I was confused and furious. I had cheated on him, and he didn't even care enough to ask where I'd been. It was like I was invisible to him. That was when I convinced myself that he had to be planning to break up with me. Why else would he be so indifferent? If he wasn't jealous, if he didn't even care enough to ask questions, then clearly he didn't love me anymore. I thought I had one last chance to keep him with me, one last way to get through to him before he ended things for good. So I doubled down. I was convinced that if one night out wasn't enough, then maybe more would be, and if one guy didn't spark a reaction, maybe several would. It sounds insane. I know it does, but I wasn't exactly thinking clearly at the time. I went on a bit of a spree. I was clubbing, drinking, and sleeping with other men. Sometimes it was quick, empty nights, and sometimes it was more drawn out. Some I remember vividly, like the man who I hooked up in a club bathroom, or one who even cooked me breakfast the morning after. Others I barely thought about then, and I barely remember now. And through it all, I made sure Nolan knew enough to suspect something. I'd come home late, and I wouldn't bother explaining. I wanted him to ask. I wanted him to demand answers, to accuse me, to finally show me that I mattered enough to him that he couldn't stand the thought of me with other people. But still, Nolan barely reacted. He had to have known. I made it all so obvious, and yet, he didn't say a word. There was just one time where he told me to make sure I kept my location on, and that was all. I felt like I was going insane. I was humiliating myself, and he wouldn't even give a shit. By then, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to keep going. Half the time, I hated myself for what I was doing. The other half, I hated him for making me feel like I had to. I couldn't understand why he didn't just end it, why he wouldn't tell me to leave if he didn't love me anymore. It was almost like he wanted me to spin in circles and go nuts, while he carried on with his life as if nothing was happening. And then came his birthday. A few nights ago, Nolan turned 31. His friends and I had planned something small, a chill night at a club downtown. I told myself I'd be on my best behavior, that I'd keep it together and just try to enjoy the night for his sake. At first it was fine. He seemed genuinely happy, surrounded by his friends, laughing more than I'd seen him laugh in months. But the longer I watched, the more it started to piss me off. He was so cold and uncaring with me at home, but there he was, smiling with everyone else. I saw him hug all his buddies, practically bend over laughing, and buy the whole table a round of drinks. I couldn't stop thinking why them and not me. Why did they get his happiness and attention while I got silence? All the resentment, all the panic and fear I'd been carrying for months started bubbling over. And before I could stop myself, I decided I couldn't hold it in anymore. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to him and asked if I could pull him aside. He looked like he would rather do anything else, but he agreed. When we were alone, I finally asked the questions that had been eating away at me for months. I asked if he hated me, if that was why he'd been acting so strange. I asked if he didn't care about me at all anymore, or love me, and I was already tearing up when I asked why he didn't just leave me if he didn't want to be in the relationship. If he was so miserable with me, why was he still here? He barely reacted. He gave me this annoyed look, like I was ruining his mood, and told me not to do this here. Not now. Like I was some child throwing a tantrum or something. That was what tipped me over. Everything came rushing out of me at once. I didn't even care how loud I was or who could hear me. I snapped, and I was practically yelling when I told him that I had been with other men for months, that I'd gone out, let strangers touch me, fuck me, and he hadn't even noticed. I told him that he didn't care because he wasn't the man he used to be, that he was a pathetic excuse for the boyfriend he once was, and that it was his fault that I'd gone looking for something he wouldn't give me. But even then, after I confessed to betraying him over and over, he still looked at me with that same unfazed expression. He was annoyed, I could tell that much, but it wasn't because of what I told him. I could tell he was just upset that I was spoiling his party with my meltdown. Like he was counting down the minutes until I shut up so he could go back to his friends and his drink and the party I had thrown for him. I glanced over at his friends with tears in my eyes, and that only made me angrier. They were always more important to him than me, always first in line for his attention. I was supposed to be the person he loved most, but watching them together, it felt like I was nothing more than someone he tolerated. I was about to yell again, to scream at him until he finally did something, but then one look at his friends again gave me another idea. If random men didn't matter to him, then maybe his friends would. If I really wanted to hurt him, to finally make him feel something, then that would do it. In that moment, I didn't even care about saving the relationship anymore. I just wanted to see him upset and hurt, the way I had felt for the last few months, so I lied. Through my tears, I told him that I hadn't just been with strangers. I told him I had slept with his best friend, Dustin. God, I sounded so smug, too. I really thought it would be the final straw, that he would finally explode once he heard it. But Nolan just shrugged. He didn't look shocked or devastated. He took a sip of his drink and told me that I was free to do whatever I wanted. Then he waited a bit to hear what else I had to say. When I stayed silent, he walked away. I stood there in the corner and I cried so much my head hurt. I couldn't process it. I had confessed to cheating on him with strangers. I had lied about sleeping with his best friend. I had humiliated myself in front of him and all of his friends, and he didn't care, not one bit. I watched him walk back across the room. Dustin greeted him with one of those ridiculous bro hugs, and Nolan laughed at something he said. They laughed together like nothing had happened while I was standing a few feet away crying. My heart was breaking all over again while he went on with his night as if I didn't exist. That was the lowest point of my life. I had done all of that for him and he didn't even care. In that moment, I realized I hadn't saved anything. I had just destroyed myself for nothing. And now I don't even know what my life has turned into. It's been days since that night, and somehow we're still together. I don't know if Nolan is staying with me out of some twisted desire to punish me, or if he's just too nonchalant to actually end it. For all I know, he has another girlfriend somewhere, but to me, he doesn't bring up what I said at the party. He doesn't ask questions about where I go or what I do. He just kind of exists beside me, and for some reason, I can't bring myself to leave. I don't know if it's because I still love him or because I don't know how to be without him. I think a large part of me still believes that he's the only one who will ever love me or make me feel wanted in a good way, even now, after everything, and a part of me clings to that. I think I'm still hoping that if I stay, if I wait long enough, the version of him I fell in love with will come back. But deep down, I think I know it's over. We're stuck in this weird limbo phase, but it'll expire soon, and I don't know what I'll do after that. I did so much messed up shit for him, and it was all for nothing. Now I just feel dirty all the time. I feel sick when I look at him, but I'm still with him. Maybe people were right to call me crazy. I wanted so badly to save our relationship that I destroyed any chance of having one, or a normal one anyway. I used to think that nothing was worse than being unloved, but now I know what's worse. It's loving someone who doesn't love you anymore and won't even have the decency to tell you. I don't know where we go from here. I don't know if Nolan will ever leave me or if I'll ever find the strength to leave him. I don't know. I just feel lost. And sometimes I catch myself staring at him when I'm at his place, wondering what we are now. I wonder if I've somehow managed to get into a situationship with my own boyfriend. And sometimes I wonder if somewhere deep down, he feels anything at all for me anymore. I can't help but torture myself thinking about which is worse, that he might still love me but chooses to punish me this way, or that he stopped loving me a long time ago, and I was too blind to see it or accept it. I don't know how to live with either of those, so I'm not sure where that leaves me now.